I'm John Janarone, editor-in-chief of CorpGov. Very happy to be here with our friend John Feldman, who's a partner and the head of the shareholder activism practice at Goodmans, based in Toronto, Canada. John, thanks for being with us.
Always great to see you, John. Thanks for having me.
So, John, let's start with some news. We got the Disney result, and you actually have a very interesting perspective on the universal proxy card. Can you tell that to our viewers?
Sure. I mean, I don't know if it's that interesting, but what I would say is, first of all, like many people, I was surprised that Nelson Peltz didn't get a seat. I was like everybody, not involved, watching from the outside, and it seemed to me that in using the universal proxy, there was a good chance that Mr. Peltz would have gotten a seat on Disney. So I was surprised by the outcome. But as you guys know, and as we've talked about before, universal proxy, at least in Canada, is something that's been around forever. And to me, it's never been something that is determinative of the outcome of a proxy contest. It's a good tool to have, but it's nothing that that really, in most cases, makes a material difference. And I think when the universal proxy rules came in to the US, everybody initially thought this is a big deal, but then with some hindsight, people started to realize it's a good tool, but it's not going to be the be all and end all that changes outcomes of elections. And I think if this was the reason people thought that Mr. Peltz would get a spot on Disney, clearly that wasn't it. Ultimately, successful campaigns are about convincing shareholders that your view of the world deserves recognition and board seats. So at the end of the day, universal proxy is a useful tool, but it is a tool that will, in most cases, not be the deciding factor.
That makes a lot of sense, John. Now, on that note, let's just step back. And if I can ask you, what would you say the most impactful updates have been in the last decade with regard to shareholder rights, whether from a regulatory change or a market standard change?
Well, I would say we in Canada have a bunch of advantages for shareholders, and we've talked about this a lot. But what we're finding is a lot of the U.S. practices are sort of being brought into Canada. And what I mean by that is, proxy fights have always been contentious. It's always been a bit of a battle, but that's gotten fought out in the public domain. People put out their letters. People put out their proxy circulars, and and it's a fight and it's a campaign, and that's what happens. What I've been seeing over the last little while is there's been quite a bit of use of tactics by both boards and by activists to try to gain an advantage. And an example of this that we've talked about before is with shareholder requisition. So as you know, in Canada, shareholders that own 5% have the right to requisition a special meeting of shareholders for the purpose of, among other things, removing and replacing directors. And what has emerged as a practice is boards will often take an opportunity to find reasons to reject the requisition. And why that's interesting is because, to me, that is something that you see a lot in the US when it comes to advance notices. There's been fights and battles and court decisions over boards trying to reject activists' nominations when they provide advance notice. And so that the gamesmanship that we're seeing, on both sides of the border just seems to be increasing. And, as you guys know, I represent in Canada, we represent both activists and boards. We don't just pick one side. And so sometimes we use these tactics, sometimes we fight against these tactics. But if I'm just stepping back, it does create a lot of noise. And sometimes it just takes away from the main issue, which is two competing visions of, the future direction of a company. And so sometimes you have to play these games, but I would love to live in a world where they weren't necessary. We're not there right now, but that's sort of the market. And unfortunately, you kind of have to play the game sometimes, which is disappointing. But when you're on a fight, you are typically looking for the levers that are available to you to gain leverage vis-a-vis the other side. And sometimes, it's necessary to undertake certain tactics that, might not be the best for everybody, but if they're done with a purpose and a larger strategy, maybe it's bringing people to the table, maybe it's sort of getting to some sort of negotiation, then there's value there. But people have to be careful not to go too far. And I worry to a certain extent that it may be going a little too far these days.
Makes a lot of sense, Sean. Now, do you have any advice for American investors who are considering running an activist campaign in Canada or more broadly overseas anywhere?
Sure, sure. I mean, well, with Canada, it's interesting. Like, 10 plus years ago, there's this thing that we call it's called a border, and when you cross it, you're into a different country. So we're Canada, you're the U.S., and the issue is sometimes our American friends, clients, law firms, they think that the rules that are of the game in the U.S. are the same as in Canada, and obviously they're not. And I think a lot of our clients have gotten smarter and more sophisticated and realize it's important to have an on-the-ground team. It's important to have, local counsel, local proxy advisors, even local PR people. Counsel's obvious. I mean, the laws are different, so you need somebody that knows the laws. Proxy solicitors, somewhat obvious because the plumbing of getting proxies votes to come in is very country specific, and you really need people to understand how to get in to the shareholders and figure out how to get those votes out. And the third thing that is really interesting to me is you need PR that knows sort of the local or national news media, because you need to have relationships with the people that are in the media to make sure that your side of the story is told in a way that, at minimum reflects reality and, ultimately is favorable to your side. And so it's really important, I think, when you're doing these deals and doing these fights, whether it's in Canada or Europe or Asia, to have people on the ground who know what they're doing. Because there are nuances that get lost if you don't do this every day in this jurisdiction. And I think generally people are getting smarter. Every once in a while that doesn't happen. And I think it's generally to the detriment of the non-Canadian, in our case, coming in without that team on their side. So and it's easier for me when I'm working with them to know that I'm dealing with people that know what they're doing in their aspects. It just makes it easier to eliminate friction that is otherwise not necessary in these fights, because they're hard enough as it is. So why put yourself at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the other side who's playing with home court advantage? The other thing that that you have to understand is there is a certain degree of, and now I'm talking about U.S. activists or foreign activists coming into Canada. There is some deference, whether it's in the courts, whether it's the regulators, to the home field. And so, you have to understand that, I mean, it's not like we're not a banana republic in any way, shape, or form, but there is some sense of, I would say, home field advantage when you're coming in the PR perspective, regulatory perspective, protecting Canada perspective. There is that element. It's not overt, but, on the margins, again, that's the kind of thing that could be to the disadvantage of the dissident. And so they just need to understand, they just need to get as much of a home team advantage as they possibly can for themselves, recognizing that they are the outsider coming in. And usually, the home court will use that to their advantage, and, with shareholders and the media, foreign takeover, without paying a premium, all that type of stuff. You hear it all the time. And it's something that people should be mindful of when they're coming across, because it does matter.
That's really insightful stuff, John. Last question for you, and this relates to the first thing we discussed. The U.S. basically imported UPC from you guys. Do you think there should be any more importing and exporting going on? Are things that we do better than you do, or vice versa, that you'd like to see, be adopted by the other country?
Well, it's interesting. One thing I've been involved in a few of the big cross-border fights. Obviously, last year with Victory Brothers and Primo. Now we're doing Gildan, and it's interesting. Like, one thing that I find interesting in the U.S., which is so different in Canada. I mean, the U.S. requires the SEC has to review proxy materials before they go out. It's a slower process. Whereas in Canada, we don't have to do that. We just we get our proxy materials ready. They're good to go. Nobody reviews them. They're off to the races. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, who am I to tell the U.S. government what to do? But it just really slows things down. It seems so inefficient to have to run through the SEC every time you're putting out proxy materials to have them take a look at it. It's Big Brother's watching. And I mean, you have the most sophisticated parties in the world in the U.S. doing these fights. So I find that a little strange. And I hope that never comes to Canada. One thing that we see happening in Canada quite often is the weaponization of regulators in fights. So, for example, where a party will make a complaint to a securities regulator and then start a hearing, and it ends up costing people money and time and distraction in a way that I don't think it's done in the U.S. I mean, they do bed bug letters in with the SEC, but I think in Canada there's so many hearings that take place when fights happen that are so tactical in nature and are such a distraction again to the fundamental issue of whose idea is better. And so, maybe what I'd like to see is a little bit more reluctance on the part of parties to use these regulators weaponize. I know they don't like it, but they're put in a position where they kind of have to react. And so until that changes, I think you see that on a lot of fights. And and again, it's all tactical, like I said at the beginning, but it's a practice that maybe if people used a little bit more caution and thought the way they do in the US, like that would be a good thing to bring into Canada. Obviously, the great from a shareholder's perspective, the ability under the corporate statute, a fundamental right in Canada to be able to call to requisition a special meeting is such a fundamental right to shareholders in Canada that is not really there for our friends in the US. And I mean, from a shareholder perspective, it really is a powerful tool. And so that's something, I mean, that would take a major change in law in the US, which I don't see happening anytime soon. But that's a huge advantage for shareholders in Canada and a huge disadvantage, I guess, for companies in Canada. So I guess it depends where you fall on that spectrum. I'm sure people would have very strong views either way. But those are just some of the major differences and sort of things I've seen over the last little while. Excuse me.
All right. Well, John, we're going to leave it there. This has been really comprehensive, helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in person very soon, my friend. Thanks for joining us. This has been John Feldman, partner at Goodmans. I'm John Jannerum signing off.
Thanks, Sean.